It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Rabbi Kimche. It's a cliche that a speaker needs no introduction, but of course, Rabbi Kimche, in this case, you truly need no introduction. Welcome back to your pulpit at Ner, the virtual pulpit on this occasion. Rabbi Kimche's title is Rabbi Sachs and the Power of an Idea. But before I hand over to Rabbi Kimche, I hope you'll forgive me if I talk for a moment about Rabbi Kimche and the power of an idea. Some 35 years ago, Rabbi Kimche, you and a small group of visionary lay leaders had an idea. And I hope as you join us today and as you watch your Kehillah from Eretz Israel, I hope that you get nachas from the power of that idea that you conceived of some 35 years ago. And just to see this assembly here of members of the community, friends of the community, alumni of the community, I see faces here watching from close and from afar, from Eretz Israel. So Rabbi Kimche, I very much look forward now to hearing your share and to handing over to you. On a technical level, Rabbi Kimche is happy for questions to be asked, so please use either the chat feature or the unmute option, which I'll enable so that people can unmute themselves if they so wish. Rabbi Kimche, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Zobin. It's really, I must say, heartwarming to see you all on the screen. It would be even nicer to see you all in person. And please God, B'korov Mamash, very soon we'll be able to get together with each other. Preferably you should all come here to Yerushalayim. That would be my first choice. Failing that, I'll come and visit you. Please God, as soon as the sky is open and the opportunity is there. We're all hoping and praying that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should send a refuah in the form of a vaccine, and that will be a game changer for us all. But in the meantime, it's wonderful to have an opportunity to see you all and to share a few reminiscences, a few thoughts, and a few divrei Torah. Many of you know, of course, that Rabbi Sachs was a good friend of mine and a colleague for 40 years in London, and we did lots and lots of things together, including the creation of Ner Yisrael. Rabbi Sachs had an important part in putting Ner Yisrael together, in encouraging me and the founding members to go ahead with a startup community in 1984. And that's certainly something that he was very proud of and mentioned it repeatedly. You also know, many of you in the Kehillah will know that we invited Rabbi Sachs regularly into the shul as a speaker, and every time he came, he never disappointed. The loss of Rabbi Sachs, apart from it being a terrible personal loss for myself, a loss of a good friend, has been an immeasurable loss for Klal Yisrael. Rabbi Sachs played a unique role, which I will describe in a few moments. A unique role. He was, of course, a member of the fraternity of Orthodox Rabbanim, but he was sui generis. He was actually one of a kind. He didn't follow the beaten path in the way Rabbanim learnt and taught Torah, and he was somebody who had his own quite unique voice, which was immediately recognizable, and his own unique concept of his tafkid, of the role that he could play as a Talmud Chacham, as an Orthodox rabbi, and this was something quite exceptional. Many of you will have heard the story, but I'll mention it just again very briefly, that actually he started off his career without any intentions of coming into the rabbinate. He was a top-class academic philosopher with his undergraduate work in Cambridge and his postgraduate work in Oxford, and he was on his way to becoming a academic philosopher of the highest order. And then he went to America and he met there Soloveitchik and he met there Lubavitcher Rebbe. And very briefly, the Lubavitcher Rebbe challenged him because the Lubavitcher Rebbe was in the business of creating people who would change the world. And he asked Rabbi Sachs, so tell me, the Jewish students in Oxford and Cambridge, tell me about them. He said, well, sadly, most of them are on a one-way ticket out of Judaism. They're assimilating. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe says to him, so what are you doing about that? So he says, what do you mean, what am I doing about that? I'm just a an academic. What can I? Says, no, what are you doing about this? You have talents. If you are in that position, Baruch has put you there for a purpose, and you have to do something about it. And he told me afterward, and he mentioned it publicly a few times as well, that question bounced around in his mind for months. Couldn't shake that question out of his head. What am I doing about it? And because of that question, that challenge from a world leader of Jewish life, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, even as a Litvak, I was an admirer of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and how he appointed people around the world to give a message. Because of that, he changed his entire program of life. And I'll tell you even more than that. I knew him quite well. He didn't only change his program for life, his career choice, he actually changed himself, something which I've very rarely seen people do, because he was really by nature quite an introvert and quite shy, not a people's person, not a public person at all. He was actually temperamentally very suited to be an academic. But he decided that no, that's not what he is in this world for. He's in this world for a mission. He's going to get up there. He's going to train himself to speak to people, to get to know people, to understand society, to become a voice in this world. And that was really an amazing achievement, amazing achievement. I'll just add one small personal anecdote, and then I'm going to move on to Divrei Torah of his. And that was really the last major conversation I had with him was about 4 years ago, when I was deciding, yes, to go on Aliyah or not to go on Aliyah. And there were reasons for and against, and many of my rabbinic colleagues told me not to go. I felt very strongly to go. And I went to sat in his house in Golders Green over a cup of tea for quite a long time, and we discussed lots of issues together. But there's one line I'm going to share with you, one line, which made a big impact on me, and in retrospect was quite a sad premonition, actually. He said to me at the time, look, I can see going to Israel is very deep in your heart, in your mind, your neshama, means a lot to you. My advice to you is, if it really means so much to you, things that mean a lot to you, you've got to do them sooner rather than later, because no one knows how long they've got. That's what he said. Nobody knows how long you've got. And if it's really important to you, do it now. Don't delay it. Because I said to him, maybe I'm going 5 years' time. No, don't delay it. No one knows how long you've got. And here he is, sadly, at the age of 72, in the prime of his life. HaKadosh Baruch Hu took him away from us, and we are all very saddened, deeply saddened, and a loss for Klal Yisrael and a loss for mankind. Let me now give you a couple of the Divrei Torah, which I think really epitomize what was it that Rabbi Sachs wanted to do in this world. It sounds like a rather large question. But what was unique, really, about his approach to Judaism? Now, my guess is that everybody here listening to this shir you've heard in your life quite a number of different Rabbonim speaking, including myself. You've probably heard over the years, once or twice, different Rabbonim. And I'd like to just share with you a perspective here, which is important, which is crucial, without which you can't understand this phenomenon that was Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha. Most Rabbonim, including myself, consider ourselves to be in the business of teaching Torah. And to whom do we teach Torah? Who is our audience? And the answer is Torah Tzivolonu Moshe Merosha Kilas Yaakov. We're teaching Torah to Klal Yisrael. We're teaching Torah to the Jewish people, to every Jew that we can find. We want to Shinantom Levonecha V'Dibarta Bam. We teach Levonecha. We teach to Talmidim. Rashi says Levonecha means Talmidim. That's who we teach. However, that is really only half the story. The truth is, and let me introduce you maybe to a different perspective for a moment. And probably the best way to introduce you to that is with two words that appear in Sefer Dvarim. They appear twice, actually. Once right at the beginning of Sefer Dvarim, it says, Ho'il Moshe Be'er as HaTorah Hazos, Ba'er Heitev. Moshe Rabbeinu began now in Sefer Dvarim teaching the Torah, Ba'er Heitev. What does that mean, Ba'er Heitev? So Ba'er, Beis Aleph Reish, comes the word Bi'ur, to explain. Well explained. And the question is, what do you mean Moshe Rabbeinu now in the last 5 weeks of his life Now he's starting to teach the Torah well explained. What's he been doing for 40 years? He's been teaching Torah for 40 years, non-stop, round the clock. What is happening here now in Sefer Devarim that wasn't happening previously? Okay, the truth is that's a very big question, and everyone understands. Every scholar, every Talmud Chacham knows that Sefer Devarim has a different voice, a different message to the first 4 books. But Rashi here gives us 2 words from the Gemara in Seitar. What does Ba'er Heitev mean? It means B'shivim Loshen. That's what Rashi says. B'shivim Loshen in 70 languages. Okay, this phrase reappears later on in Parshas Kisavai with the mitzvah of Avonim Gedolos. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, when you come into Eretz Yisrael, you have to write the Torah on these stones, Ba'er Heitev. Well explained. And Rashi again there says, B'shivim Loshen, 70 languages. And the question is obvious. 70 languages? What was 70 languages at that time? Ancient Hittite, ancient Akkadian, ancient Egyptian, maybe some ancient Greek. All the ancient languages, none of which the Jewish people spoke or understood. Why would Moshe teach the Torah in a multilingual way in lots of languages that he didn't have an audience for them at all? What could this possibly mean? B'shivim Loshen. Before I should deal with this question, but the general trend of the answer, which to me seems absolutely crystal clear, is brought, for example, in the Ksava Kabbalah, in the tradition of the Vilna Gaon. The Ksava Kabbalah writes that this is a metaphor. Of course, he wasn't suddenly starting to speak Hittite and Akkadian and all these other languages. This was a metaphor that for the following idea. And if you understand this idea properly, you can start to understand what Rabbi Sachs was doing in his life. The idea is that within the Torah, there are actually 2 different dimensions. One dimension is Merosha Kilas Yaakov, that we need to learn Shabbos and Yom Tov and Bris Milah and Yom Kippur and Pesach Shabbos and Sukkot. We need to learn Torah in all its details. But there's another dimension to Torah, which is that within Torah there are ideas. Ideas which are relevant to the Umos Ha'olam, to mankind. Not only to Klal Yisrael, not just Merosha Kilas Yaakov, but really we have at our fingertips certain ideas which human society can benefit from. And part of our job as students and teachers of Torah has to be to extract those ideas and formulate them in such a way that they become over la seicha, they become a currency which is intelligible beyond the Jewish people, into the nations of the world. And the nations of the world can benefit from the wisdom of the Torah. And that's what it means that Moshe Rabbeinu in Sefer Devarim starts teaching them ideas which can then be sent, if you like, beyond, like a satellite being sent beyond the solar system, beyond the realms of Klal Yisrael. We are able to teach certain key ideas. But in order to teach them, we have to somehow extract them from their context and formulate them in a universal way. And this is what Rabbi Sachs was doing his whole life. He was learning Torah, teaching Torah, and he would teach the normal ideas of Torah, the normal way of understanding with Rishonim and Achronim and Midrashim and Psukim and everything. And then suddenly he would take off. And a new idea suddenly would be launched out of the Pasuk and out of the text, an idea which he could then share with the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he could share it with the Dalai Lama, right? Because this was one of his amazing abilities. I don't know another Orthodox rabbi today on planet Earth who was able to sit with prime ministers, Tony Blair, John Major, and others, Cameron, and to explain to them the ideas which were derived from the Torah, which were then able to be used in a context of their life and principles and values which were important for managing their life better. I remember he told once the story that he was on a plane flying to Israel, from London, together with Tony Blair and John Major, and I think Prince Charles as well, for the funeral of Yitzhak Rabin. And so he was sitting there, and what was he doing when you're sitting in a plane for a few hours? It wasn't a commercial flight, it was a private flight. And he took out his Mikros Gedolos, and he was learning Chumash. So John Major says to him, what are you doing? He says, I'm studying Bible. He says, is it interesting? He says, it's absolutely fascinating. He says, well, share it with us. Tell us something that you're learning. Right? So I want you to imagine the scene. Here's Rabbi Sachs with Prince Charles, John Major, and one or two other dignitaries there whose names I've forgotten. And suddenly, there he is. He's challenged to take a pasuk, choose a pasuk, and from it extract an idea. It's no good telling him a diuk in Rashi. Why does Rashi use this word, not that word? Why is there an extra bob in the pasuk? Why? It's no good going into the general, if you like, Talmudic and rabbinic analysis of the text. You've got to take the text as a runway and then take off and then get into the world of universal ideas. And in the world of universal ideas, you've suddenly got something that you can communicate with the Umos HaOlam, with the nations of the world who are hungry to hear something which is based in genuine wisdom, the wisdom of the Torah. I forget a little bit what he told me once, what it was he said on that flight. I don't remember exactly what it was, but maybe some of you know, or maybe some of you heard in some of his other talks, but he on many, many occasions, when he told me whenever he met Tony Blair told him that he grew up as a Bible reading Christian, and he read parts of the Bible every day. And whenever he met Jonathan Sachs, he would say to him, right, today I read this and this and this verse. What does it mean? And whenever he did that, Rabbi Sachs would give him a completely new insight into what the Torah was talking about, something which was relevant to him, something which was in a different way, Torah Chai. This is a project which hardly any other rabbi is actually even aiming at or has a goal to produce ideas which can be then said to. I've had the experience a few times when I needed to give a gift to a non-Jewish person who maybe I'd worked with or done something with. I used to give them a gift of one of Rabbi Sachs's books, and they would come back and say, we've never heard anything like this before. We've never read anything like this before. Because this was something which the Archbishop of Canterbury was always very, very complimentary and very impressed by the ideas he heard from Rabbi Sachs. Let me give you a couple of examples of a Dvar Torah which he was then able to, if you like, transform into an idea. I want you to understand, ideas then are universal currency, right? Psukim and Rashi and Midrashim are not universal currency. They are internal wisdom of Klal Yisrael. But in it, there is Shivim Lashon. There are ideas which can be transformed into something interesting, which the whole world is interested in. So let me give you one or two ideas. A simple pasuk. Vayom Hashem al Avram, lech lecha me'artzecha, moladcha beis avicha, el ha'oretz asher arecha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the very first prophecy that Avram Avinu gets is to leave his father's house, his birthplace, and his country, and go to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, very nice. Everyone's heard that pasuk. Everyone knows that pasuk. It's the beginning of the life of Avram Avinu. It's an important turning point in the whole of the Chumash. Right before that, it's if you like, from a Jewish history point of view, everything before that pasuk is prehistoric in terms of Jewish history. Jewish history begins with that pasuk, with Avram Avinu on his travels to Eretz Yisrael, and that's the foundation, the first rung of the ladder of Jewish history. But the question is, why does this pasuk say, why are we interested in where he's going from? You should just say, Avram, lech lecha, go to Eretz Yisrael, and ha'oretz asher arecha. What is the point of these three words? So, various different Mefarshim explain, the Malbim's got a whole arichos on it, but Rabbi Sachs came along and he said, look, what's going on here? Avraham Avinu has to show to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that his life decisions are a different type of life decisions that anybody else has made before. He's not making life decisions the same way as earlier generations have made. He's heard the Dvar Hashem. He's heard the voice of God. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu has created the human being as a Tzelem Elokim, right? Tzelem Elokim, in the image of God, means lots of different things, but primarily it means with freedom of choice, free to choose to do the right thing and equally free to choose to do the wrong thing. Sadly, for all the generations, the 20 generations before Avraham Avinu, mankind had by and large chosen to do the wrong thing, with a few exceptions, Noach and Shem, etc. But here Avraham Avinu had to choose to do the right thing. Now, said Rabbi Sachs as follows: using b'chira chofshit, using the freedom of choice, right, or vocharto b'chai, and to choose to do the right thing. This idea has been challenged over the centuries in many different ways. There are many different schools of thought which have taught and been very emphatic about various different forms of determinism. Determinism is the opposite of the freedom of choice. Determinism means that the human being is caught up in forces which are beyond his control, and therefore our decisions in our life are really a product not of our freedom of choice, right, but of the fact that we are simply a victim of circumstances. So there are three different main schools in the last couple of hundred years of determinism, right? There is, for example, the Marxist theory of history, which is materialistic and based on economics, and that basically all our important decisions in life are driven by profit, gain, and loss, and the economics. And the economics of the world is really what runs the world, and everything else is just an illusion, right? And that there is no real freedom of choice for an individual. We are all locked in to various economic forces. It's the economic forces that run the world, says Marxism, right? And therefore, in order to create equality, we have to equalize all the economic forces. And then but there is no freedom of choice in a Marxist system of thought. Now, in the ancient world, wealth was all land-based. There was no stock market and credit cards and bank accounts. Wealth was in the land, right? So lech lecha me'artzecha meant you have to leave behind any ideas of wealth and property. You've got to leave that behind. To make a decision, you have to get beyond the idea that materialism determines our choices. Me'artzecha is a reference to what the circumstances of one's birth. He spoke about geneticists and even Spinoza. Spinoza famously denied the possibility of bechira chofshis, of freedom of choice, saying that we're living in a world of necessity. The laws of nature are all necessary laws, and we are caught up in the laws of nature. He didn't know modern science, but modern scientists, biologists, and brain chemists all say that all our decisions are basically a product of our brain chemistry, which is not there's no freedom of choice there at all. We think we have freedom of choice, but it's an illusion. So that's me'artzecha. You have to get beyond that. And what is moladetzecha? Moladetzecha is where you were born, your family circumstances. So that's already psychologists and Freudians who will tell you that your early experiences in your childhood really create a subconscious which frames all your future decisions. You don't really have any freedom of choice at all. So suddenly what's happened here, I want you to pay attention to what's happened here. Here we are learning a pasuk in Bereshis. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Avraham Avinu, Lech lecha. Suddenly in Rabbi Sachs's hands, this has become a seminar in freedom versus determinism, in freedom of choice. Are we free to choose our values and make our decisions based on what we consider to be right and wrong, right? And suddenly we're into a whole new area, which is an idea, which he can share with a non-Jewish world. That the non-Jewish world, he will say that actually the Torah gives us, right, this concept of the human being. Indeed, of course, there are Marxist forces and there are genetic forces and there are psychological forces. And the truth is most people, most of the time, are in fact influenced by all these forces. We're not denying all this dynamics, but the idea of the neshama, that the human being has a neshama which can get beyond all of these considerations and decide to follow the Devar Hashem, that is the first key principle of Jewish life. And that is the Bechira Chofshis. So the Rambam writes in Hilchos Tshuva, chapter 5, he says, Bechira, our belief in Uvacharto B'chaim, in freedom of choice, is the Ikar HaGodol Sha'akol Tolui Boy. Everything depends. If we don't believe in freedom of choice, there's no Torah, there's no mitzvahs, there's no morality, there's nothing. Right? You've got to first establish that. And that's why this pasuk is written the way it's written. And this is just, I want to tell you, I've heard that pasuk taught and explained dozens of times in my life. And I've read about it, we've shown him and I've heard him and everything. When I heard Rabbi Sachs explaining this pasuk in the context of the debate between systems of determinism and against freedom of will, the whole pasuk suddenly sounded quite different. Right? And suddenly you understood what was really going on here. And the interesting thing is that even even a non-Jewish listener could appreciate it, right? And of course, once you formulated the ideas, it's not only that he was aiming at the non-Jewish world, he was also aiming at the non-observant Jewish world, the Jewish world who are not Osek B'Torah, who are not students of Rashi and Rambam and Medrash and Tanakh, but people who had only a very vaguest idea of what it meant to be Jewish. Suddenly Rabbi Sachs was telling them, no, the Torah is discussing the most vital principles and ideas of mankind. And this is what. So this is, I think, an interesting example of taking a pasuk and extracting from it an idea. Rabbi Sachs often said that in the materialistic world, in the general non-Jewish world, right, the belief is a belief in power, the power, economic power, military power, political power, scientific power. They believe in the idea of power, and that really controls the world. We, he says, we believe in the power of an idea, not the idea of power, but the power of an idea. An idea can change the world because an idea changes the way you think about things. And if you think about them differently, you'll feel differently about them. And if you feel differently, you'll act differently, and suddenly you're a different person. And therefore, the idea is crucial. You have to be able to grasp the phenomenal ideas which are buried within the Torah, and to access those ideas. That was the goal of his life. He wanted on every occasion to find ideas which he could then teach on a universal level. Right? Some of you might have seen a televised discussion he had in front of a large audience with the Dalai Lama. Right? The Dalai Lama is one of the Gedolim of the Buddhist religion, and a spokesperson for the Tibetan monks, and there was Rabbi Sachs speaking with the Dalai Lama, and he's speaking with him about Divrei Torah, right? But who's able to do that? And he's only able to do that because he can extract from the words of Koheles and discuss with what does it mean to be besimcha, and what is the difference between the Buddhist concept of simcha and the Jewish idea of simcha and the Buddhist idea of meditating and the Jewish idea of prayer. And he's completely familiar with Buddhism. You'd think he'd grown up studying Buddhism. This actually brings me to something else about Rabbi Sachs, which of course made it all possible, that he was the most remarkable intellectual genius that I've met. Totally able to encompass with absolute genius. He could read books in a way that was incredible. The hardest books in philosophy, in psychology, in social sciences, in political theory, and he would devour the books. And once he'd read a book, that's it. He knew it for life, and he could cite from it and quote from it and compare it to other views. And it was just mind-boggling the way he was able to do that. And that was really something quite extraordinary, really quite extraordinary. Let me go into another interesting idea, which he was very fond of. I'm looking at the clock here. Before I go into another example, I just want to mention that there is a pasuk in Tehillim, Kuf Yud Tes. Tehillim Kuf Yud Tes, David HaMelech says, Va'adabra va'edosecha neged melachim v'loi evoish. I will speak about your laws in front of kings, meaning non-Jewish kings, v'loi evoish, and I will not be embarrassed. Right? David HaMelech is saying one is able to speak about the wisdom of the Torah in front of kings and do it proudly. And very few people have actually been able to do that, I'll be quite honest with you. Very few people are actually able to go to prime ministers and presidents and leaders of the academic world and the scientific world and sit with them and proudly and confidently and accurately discuss Torah ideas without any hesitation. He had a unique blend of total, formidable intellect and personal passion, a tangible passion, combined with modesty and humor. He never lost his dignity. He never got angry or got upset or anything. He was completely focused. Some of you might have seen the televised broadcast. Some of my televised broadcast of Rabbi Sachs debating Richard Dawkins. I don't know if you remember, Richard Dawkins is probably well known to be, he's a scientist from Oxford or Cambridge, one of the top scientists, and he wrote this book, which he called it The God Delusion. The God Delusion. He wrote it, I don't know, about 15 years ago, and it became a bestseller. It sold millions and millions, and it was the most militant atheistic book on the market. He wrote in his introduction, the goal of this book is, if you have even the slightest belief in God, when you open the book, by the time you finish this book, it'll be gone. That's the goal of this book. That's what Richard Dawkins wrote. And he's the most militant. Rabbi Sachs got up, arranged a public debate with him, and debated with him about his book and about science and he did it in the most, as a gentleman with dignity and with erudition and in the most amazing way. In the most amazing way. Just to give you a small snippet of that, part of the book is about how many wars have been fought in world history because of religious wars, and therefore religion is a danger to mankind because it causes people to kill each other, and therefore we're better off without it. That was basically one of the theories of a large part of that book. So Rabbi Sachs gently takes him around the idea. He says, look, is it not true that we share with each other a belief in science? We believe in science and the importance of science and technology and the value of science. Is yes, absolutely. He said, but don't you agree that science has often been abused, misused by people who can use scientific power, atomic power, and all sorts of other biological warfare for destructive purposes? There's no difficulty with misusing scientific inventions. But what is the answer to bad science, to misused science? The answer is good science. He says, there's no question that the religion has been misused by people over the centuries for their own political, aggressive, and pathological problems, right? But the answer to bad religion is not no religion. The answer to bad religion is good religion. And he just takes him gently down a path of an argument which basically completely invalidates about a third of the book in 10 minutes. And it was just done very gentlemanly and very kindly and very subtly. And it was just, it was an amazing performance. In my opinion, he was much too gentle with the man. He should have made mincemeat out of him. And he could have, I know he could have, but he wasn't like that. He was like very, very dignified and very understated. At the end of the day, he was an Englishman, right? He was an Englishman, and that very much was part of his style. And he was truly remarkable at that. One of the things...
Rabbi Kimche, before you
Sure.
go any further, I have a question here that someone posted in the chat group, which they asked me to ask you. They said, without being too messianic about it, can you just speak a little bit about this particular ability to speak to all peoples, all leaders, all religions, and the concept of Torah one day being universal in the Messianic era, and just any thoughts about that?
Thank you, Rabbi Zobin, and I'd like to just thank Rabbi Zobin generally for the contact we've kept up since I've left London, and the friendship and the amazing work he's doing at Ner Yisrael, and I'm looking forward to coming and seeing you in the near future. Yes, there's no question about it that when we speak about the Messianic era, right, we are definitely speaking about the idea. V'yeda kol pa'ul ki ato pa'alto, v'yovin kol yotzur ki ato yitzarto, v'yoma kol asher neshama ba'apo Hashem Elokei Yisrael Melech. The idea that the umos ha'olam, the nations of the world, will come to a new recognition, a recognition of the truth of the Torah, the beauty of the Torah, the importance of emunah. That is definitely part of the messianic vision, and there's no question that what Rabbi Sachs was doing was a little bit, let's say, a nitzoitz, a little spark of that idea and that goal. I don't want anybody to come away from this talk this morning and people asking, what did Rabbi Kimche say? He said Rabbi Kimche said that Rabbi Sachs was Mashiach. That's not my goal here this morning. You do understand that, don't you, right? It's not my goal that he's not Mashiach, but definitely it's true. The idea of being an Orel HaGoyim, right? The word Orel HaGoyim is used by Yeshaya to describe the Messianic era, to be in some way a light unto the nations. Now, here's the interesting thing that Rabbi Sachs mentioned on a few occasions. He says, we have today, he said, conditions of the Jewish people which have never existed before. Because two elements have come together. One element is we have a sovereign Jewish state of Israel, which gives us a base, gives us confidence, gives us an identity. And we have a tolerant, religiously tolerant diaspora. We've never in history had these two elements coming together. And it's because these two elements have come together, we are now in a position to engage in what I'm engaging in, because we have the identity, we have the confidence, and we have the audience. We have an audience of people who want to hear. They want to hear the Dvar Hashem. It's an amazing thing. It's just that we need to find a nusach. We need to find a vocabulary within which to formulate it. So if you want to have a look, for example, at one of the latest books, Rabbi Sachs wrote in his life, I believe, 36 books. One of the latest ones is called Morality. And the word morality, and that book really is a Musa book to mankind. And really using the most amazing array of the latest books on social sciences and analyzing society and all its difficulties. He shows that actually what we need is to renew religious beliefs and faith, and that faith will result in a value system, and a value system will result in what he calls a social covenant, where people coming together in a shared value system that really changes society completely. Right? The secular philosophers spoke about a social contract, right? John Locke and David Hume in the 17th century spoke about a social contract, but as he says, a contract is simply two people coming to an agreement with self-interest. Each of them has got self-interest. The government wants the obedience and the taxes from the people, and the people want from the government protection and of various sorts. But he says a social contract doesn't create a society. It creates a nation, but not a society. A society is only created by a covenant, and a covenant only comes about through a shared value system. And today, the zeitgeist, the cultural, if you like, the reigning cultural values of pluralism, multiculturalism, and atheism don't have any values at all. And in it he writes that we're living in a society, he says the free market gives us choices about what to do with our wealth, but with no indication, we have no indication at all how to make these choices. Liberal democracy gives us freedom to choose, but no one teaches us on what basis can we make any choices at all. We're in a world of freedom, but the freedom of the modern world gives us only free fall. We're in a situation where there's no value system. We're not teaching our children in any of our universities or schools any values. And science gives us tremendous powers, but with no idea what to do. If you ask a scientist, what should I do with these powers? They'll say to you, it's not my department. I don't know what you should do with it. I'm creating a new type of bomb. I'm creating a new type of mobile phone, a new type of a satellite. What should I do with it? Who knows? There are no value. If you have no value systems, you've got no idea what to do with your newfound freedom and powers. And the way he writes about this, and the way he quotes, and the way he cites from the latest research analyzing society and the difficulties of society, the loneliness. It's got a whole chapter there on loneliness, which is extraordinary, a really extraordinary chapter about how unless you have a real community, you end up with loneliness. And loneliness is the greatest mental and physical hazard to health in the 21st century. Read the book, Morality, chapter on loneliness. It's really extraordinary. But what he wants to do is to explain that faith and the belief in a value system and belief that God has created the world and the world has a purpose. And in that purpose, we can find our way to do chesed, to achieve things of value. That is something which is of the greatest significance for the Jewish people. We know all this from the Torah. In the non-Jewish world, no one speaks like that. And what was interesting, before Rabbi Sachs came along, all the religious leaders, including the Christian and Buddhist religious leaders, they were in retreat. None of them wanted to stand up on the world stage and argue their case because the dominant zeitgeist of atheism and secularism is so overwhelming that they were intimidated by it. Rabbi Sachs, in his own quiet, dignified, modest way, was completely fearless. Often when I saw him in action, I often felt that he was like a gladiator in the world of ideas. And he was fighting. He was fighting to establish. He was fighting against atheism, right? He was fighting against all sorts of against anti-Semitism. He would get up in the House of Lords and he would say to them, "You think that anti-Semitism is just a danger for the Jewish people? It isn't. Anti-Semitism is a danger for mankind. And any party which tolerates anti-Semitism has lost any moral credibility." No one says this in the House of Lords. And he said in the House of Lords, I went to visit Poland and I saw the place where the Warsaw Ghetto used to be, where hundreds of thousands of Yidden Nebuch were killed, massacred. And it's right in the middle of the city, and Warsaw was a big modern city. They all must have seen it. How was it possible for a whole city to have within them a killing machine and nobody objected? The answer is because anti-Semitism had dehumanized the Jewish people before the Holocaust, and that made it possible. But no one, and then he said, imagine we'd have in the middle of the city of London a ghetto of Hindus. An extraordinary thing to say in the House of Lords. A ghetto of Hindus. We start killing Hindus and nobody says anything about it. It's completely unimaginable, right? Why is it unimaginable? Because we are brothers. We love each other. We're part of the society. It's only possible through and he spoke about anti-Semitism just for about 10 minutes in the House of Lords, but in a way that no one has ever spoken before about anti-Semitism as a gladiator, a fighter in a very understated, modest, English way, but immensely powerful. He defended clear moral values against relativism, that everything is relative, that your value system, according to postmodern thinking, there are no values. There's just my narrative and there's your narrative, and you think this is good and I think that is good, and everybody's equally good. And that is That's called relativism, right? Relativism, he says, is destroying completely the fabric of European and Western society, and he fought against it in the most amazing way. One of the things he also fought was for the sanctity of married life, of the Jewish family, but not just the Jewish family, the sanctity of family life. That family life is based on a covenant between a man and a woman to build a family, and building a family is believing in the future. And you can only believe in the future if you have some faith. And the reason why people in Europe are not getting married and not having children is because they don't have this value system. They don't have the faith. He would say, he used to say regularly, he says that that the demography is theology. Demography is theology. You can't understand demography if you don't understand theology. Demography is the declining birth rate in Europe, which is, if you like, Europe committing a silent, quiet suicide. But project the numbers 30, 40 years forward, none of the European nations are producing enough children to sustain the population. And why not? Because people are not getting married and having children. And why not? So if you read Rabbi Sachs's books about morality and about the great partnership, it's because they don't have the faith in any values which enable them to be sufficiently selfless to get married. To get married and have children, you need to be selfless to a certain degree. And selflessness only comes as a value to give up some of your own comforts and pleasures and assets for somebody else because you believe in a greater good. You believe in a society. You believe in a future. You believe in a covenant. These ideas are not just Jewish ideas. He used to speak to these ideas with prime ministers. He used to speak to them about these ideas with some of the most influential people in Europe and abroad, past Europe. And he was really, in that sense, a bit of a prophet, right? He would feel it. What was special about the Nevi'im, that they would tell the truth to power. When they met the king was powerful, the king was all powerful, and the Navi would come up fearlessly and tell them the truth. And that was Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Sachs was able to do this. I must say, he often was criticized by other Orthodox rabbis of one sort or another, mainly because, in my opinion, they didn't understand what he was trying to do. He actually had a different objective to 99% of other Orthodox rabbis in the world. He was trying to do something else. And he presented a Judaism which a modern thinking, intellectual, sort of semi-assimilated Jew could look at him and be proud of him. He had a fantastic line which he said repeatedly in sort of different academic circles. He would say, non-Jews respect Jews who respect Judaism, because Jews who respect Judaism respect themselves. Non-Jews do not respect Jews who don't respect Judaism. And this was a line which was very powerful, went straight into the heart of lots of young men and women who wanted to be respected in the wider world, and they thought that the way to get respected was by ditching their Judaism, by walking away from their Judaism. So he wrote this book called A Letter in the Scroll, which is one of the most wonderful books to give to a young person today. A Letter in the Scroll is based on the idea, it's actually based on a vort from the Baal Shem Tov 250 years ago, that the Baal Shem Tov writes a couple of places that the whole of Klal Yisrael is like one Sefer Torah. And every member of the Jewish people in every generation is a letter in that Sefer Torah. That's what it means, a letter in the scroll. Every one of us is a letter in the Sefer Torah, and if one letter decides to walk away from Judaism, the Sefer Torah is chaser. The Sefer Torah is becomes possible because the Sefer Torah needs every letter to be present. And he writes in a letter in the scroll about the tremendous privilege and excitement about being a member of the Jewish people and what the Jewish people have to offer to mankind, and how every single goal you have in life is attainable within the context of being fully Jewish and proudly Jewish and observantly Jewish. And to become more Jewish is only going to enhance whatever it is you want to do. You want to go into science or politics or business. The more Jewish you will become more successful in what you're doing. But he says it in a way that I've never heard other people say. He had a nusach. He had a way of explaining things which was truly and utterly remarkable. Maybe I'll just end off with one last Dvar Torah of his, which I thought was also very fascinating, which we're all familiar with. Parshas Kisisa says that there's a mitzvah to count the Jewish people. How do you count the Jewish people? You don't count them 1, 2, 3, 4 with a census. You count them, everyone has to give a chatzi shekel, and then you count the shkolim, and of course we all know in the end the shkolim were counted, and there were, right, and from these shkolim they made the adonim, they made the foundations for the Mishkan. There were 100 adonim made, each one weighed 3,000 shekel of silver, so there were 600,000 chatzi shekels went into making the adonim. This is a well-known piece of chumash, which everybody should be familiar with. Rashi tells us in Parshas Truma that actually there was only one. There were three contributions the Jewish people made. One of them was this, a one-off counting in Parshas Kisisa. The other was Kol Nadiv Leiv. Everybody who was generous gave according to their generosity. Zah, B'chesef, and Choshes. That was a free will. You didn't have to give that. That was not mandatory. And then there was the annual collection of the Chatzi Shekel in Adar, which is a subject of a whole Masechta, Maseches Shkolim. Who collects it? Who gives it? It was collected in order to run the maintenance of the Beis HaMikdash, the Korban Tzibur, etc. Okay, so that's a very nice topic, and you can learn and teach about the Torah of this topic for many, many hours. You can go through the whole Maseches Shkolim and all the Meforshim on Truma and Kisisa. That's wonderful. Came along Rabbi Sachs after teaching the basics of this sugya. Says, what is this parsha telling us? It's telling us as follows. He says, if you want to measure the power of the Jewish people, ask them to give, and then measure their contribution. You can't measure the people by the numbers. Ki atem hama'at mikol ha'amim, the Pollak says in Bois Hanan, you're a small nation. We are a tiny, tiny nation in a tiny, tiny land. But our contribution to mankind is massive. You can only measure the strength and the power of the Jewish people by asking them to give of their time, give of their talent, give of their abilities, whatever it is, give philanthropically. This is the amazing power. And it's not only true about the Jewish people. The truth is the value of a man is not in it's not the power. Is what is he willing to give? You ask somebody to give, and he can give something which is worth 1,000 people. If one man comes up with a vaccine, can change the world. One person can come up with one idea and one contribution. So here's Rabbi Sachs taking this whole parsha of Terumah and extracting from it a universal idea. We don't measure human beings quantitatively, only qualitatively. You measure them by what they can give. And if you ask them to give, they will always give, and then you count up what they've given, and then you've got something which you can build the world. And this is an idea which he shared. Remember, he told me he shared this with Tony Blair once about a whole different perspective on community and on building, right? The home we build together, to everyone getting together and giving something. People are united by giving into a joint project. And they shouldn't be told they don't have to give. They have to be told that by giving, they enhance themselves and the world, and that in that way, and now with this last line I'll finish, with that way, Rabbi Sachs, his entire life, in my opinion, was a most remarkable Kiddush Hashem. Whenever I saw him in action, personally or on film or read his books, the ideas that he produced were a Kiddush Hashem in a most remarkable way. A most remarkable way. He was communicating on a world stage. He gave a TED talk, which was watched by 2 million people, about facing the future without fear. And he spoke about fear and anxiety and confidence and faith in the most remarkable way that anybody in our generation has ever spoken about it. Ladies and gentlemen, my time is up. I just want to tell you as a final comment that what I've said this morning is really, really only a fraction, is miktsas shavach, is a fraction of the tremendous impact that Rabbi Sachs had on hundreds of thousands of followers, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. His loss is a tremendous loss for people of faith and people of values worldwide. And we can only hope that Bez Hashem, his legacy will remain with us. And each one of us in our own little way should read his books, think about his thoughts. If you want to give yourself a treat, go onto YouTube, type in Rabbi Sachs, and just watch one of his talks. And it's just amazing to watch him in action, to see his choice of words, and he would always bring in little bits of humor along the way as well. I remember one occasion he was doing Aseret Tshuva, and he felt that his audience were a bit heavy. It was a bit of a heavy audience, and he said, how many psychotherapists does it take to change a light bulb? Everybody is like, and everyone knows these light bulb jokes, and it seems to be a bit out. He was talking in a big shul on Aseret Tshuva. So he says, how many psychotherapists does it take to change a light bulb? His answer is only one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. Right? And that's tshuva, he said. Tshuva is, you can read as many books on tshuva as you like, but you have to really want to change. There's an example of him just using humor in a very small way, just to lighten up the message, but even the humor was always on message. The humor was profound. In his hands, the humor became a tool for conveying the most beautiful truths of the Torah. Yehi Zichroi Baruch, his memory should be a blessing for us all, and his legacy will be with us, L'Dorei Doros. It's been a great pleasure seeing you all. Thanks again to Rabbi Zobin, the host, and I hope, please God, to be able to do similar shiurim again in the future. I wish you all the very best, and lots of love from Fia, from my wife and me in Yerushalayim. Hope to see you again very soon. Colton.
Thank you.
Shkur, Rabbi Kimche, thank you so much for that. Thank you for sharing that profound summary of Rabbi Sachs and some of his ideas and personal recollections also. The ability to share Torah be'er heitev in a manner that the wider world can relate to and yet is true to Torah is certainly the area in which Rabbi Sachs, one of the many areas in which Rabbi Sachs shone, and I think what we heard today was actually also a presentation of be'er heitev, Rabbi Kimche, as an exponent of Torah, which is always so beautifully and clearly explained. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Rabbi Pollak, but before I introduce him, we're just going to take a 2-minute break, literally a 2-minute break, just in case anyone wants a quick drink or stretch their legs a little bit. I'm aware that this is a lengthy morning, but please stay on to hear Rabbi Pollak. The next topic that's going to be addressed is a fascinating one and an important one, and one that all of us need to ask ourselves. I will introduce it in a few moments, but how Jewish philosophy is absolutely central to us understanding our place and the place of Judaism in the world. So a 2-minute break. The time on my clock is 11:34. At 11:37, we will resume with Rabbi Michael Pollak, who I will introduce at that point.